Hello everyone, welcome to my screencast. My name is Zoe Peel, and you can find my website at www.zoepeel.com, and you can find more information about that in the annotations to this video. This video is going to be about simulating watercolor painting in Adobe Photoshop. I'm using Photoshop CS4, although most of the tools that are used to accomplish this effect are really not new to Photoshop. You could probably do them all the way back to Photoshop 6 or 7 if you really want to get nostalgic. But I'm using CS4, so the interface is going to look like the tabbed interface of CS4. And what I'd like to start with is talking about the distinctive challenges of watercolor, the appeal of watercolor. If we want to simulate watercolor painting in not just a superficial way of taking a photo and doing a photo filter on it, what are we going to have to capture? What's that quintessential kind of liveliness that watercolor has? And I have a watercolor here by Jordan Mechner, who you may know as the creator of Prince of Persia and Karateka, and I didn't know that he was actually a rather talented artist, but that makes sense. Anyway, this is from his website, and one of the things that you notice about watercolor is that you get, first of all, the paper texture comes through very strongly. If you take a look here, and I can zoom in a little bit further, you can see that it's a cold pressed watercolor paper. The texture is very rough. The paint itself falls unevenly within the paper texture, and that creates a very appealing organic look. Also, you have a variation in the density of pigment. Obviously the paint is transparent, but you also, even within the transparency, you have kind of cloudy configurations of pigment and then places where the paper shows through a little bit more. Then you have zones like right in here where you see layering, the transparency of this blue over the brown and vice versa. And in general, these things are the function of natural materials and the way that they're imperfect. And getting those effects on a computer is usually more difficult than it would be to just take a brush and a simple watercolor and just go. But some of us really don't like how unforgiving watercolor can be. You put it down and it's pretty much there and you can't fix it. And if we can do something in Photoshop, why not? So I have seen a lot of tutorials about watercolor in Photoshop, and watercolor, there's a decent watercolor engine in Corel Painter, but it's very CPU intensive and it slows down. I don't have a particularly fast computer, and frankly it's not worth it if we can figure out a way to accomplish that look another way, which I think we can. Also, Painter's interface is terrible, and we want to use Photoshop for everything else, so we might as well do everything we possibly can in Photoshop unless we have a darn good reason to go into another program. So, a lot of people know that in Photoshop you can make a layer, as I have here, and you can paint on the layer, and then you can change the opacity to make it transparent, and you can layer things that way. You can blend things that way, and that gets at one of the elements of what makes watercolor appealing, but not all of them. You can also do texture overlays in Photoshop. You can apply a texture to work that you've done, or you can fill a layer with texture and then set it to multiply so that the texture acts as a kind of a filter or screen through which you see the artwork underneath. So for example, if I were to go here into this empty layer and fill it with this canvas texture, and now I set this layer to multiply. Now, and if I dial back the opacity so it's not as intense, you can see a texture and you see the color underneath, and it looks sort of like the colors on that texture paper, but not really. And furthermore, one of the issues that I want to talk about is not just achieving a trick or a look or passing something off as a simulation. What I really want to do is try to simulate the process of watercolor painting. I do watercolor painting in real life, and I have learned a bit about that process from the natural media, and there are a lot of elements to that creative process that I really enjoy. And if I can capture what it's really like to paint with watercolor in Photoshop, to me that's much more satisfying than just doing a painting in another way and then putting something over it to make it look watercolory. And thankfully, I think that I have found a technique that works very well to do that. And I'm going to show you how that works.